When you talk about bumping a player, it's pretty much
great courage. One that says the bump is dead, that's how you deliver it.
What is going on, YouTube universe? My name is Trent. Some of you guys might know me as Zirra from other content I throw out into the YouTube world. Welcome to my AFL channel, The Hip and Shoulder. This channel's only just kicking off, but it is going to be, hopefully, your one-stop shop for anything AFL related, whether it be AFL tipping videos, team discussions, Supercoach, AFL fantasy, video podcasts, anything, everything. If it's Australian rules football related, I'm hoping to drop it here, which brings us to today's video, my first round recap video podcast for the 2024 season. I'm calling it the round recap because I can't think of anything a little bit more creative. So if anybody out there, you know, has a name that I could potentially throw out there to title this as, let me know in the comment section down below. But essentially what the round recap video podcast series is going to be is a weekly video upload where we reflect on the round that just went down. We look at the stats. We talk about outcomes from games, you know, maybe some tentative umpiring decisions. And something I'm looking forward to doing is constructing my own hip and shoulder MVP each season, where just like the Brownlow gives a 3-2-1 system to players in games, I myself will be allocating a 3-2-1 system to who I think was best on ground in those games to see who can take out a invisible fucking award that nobody's ever going to care about, but I'm going to have fun doing it. And that's all that matters, right? Right. So this video is going to cover opening round, round zero, whatever you want to call it. It went down, and we kind of touched on it in my tipping video for opening round, but it's got its negatives and its positives, and we'll get into some of the negatives and some other little tidbits about the round later in the video when I turn to some social media discussion points from some of you guys out there. But the main concern seems to be surrounding the fact that only 8 teams were involved. There were only 4 games. Those 4 games were sellout games. Every single game was apparently sold to capacity, which is huge for the game. It's huge for the clubs involved, especially obviously Brisbane and Gold Coast up in Queensland and Sydney and GWS hosting in New South Wales, where they're in a more NRL rugby league dominated, you know, state here in Australia. So having that exposure for the game is absolutely fantastic. But I think that's where the positives kind of draw themselves out. And the biggest negative takeaway, and this is coming from even AFL coaches, because on AFL 360, you had Chris Scott from Geelong, which I know, for those of you who know, Chris Scott isn't, you know, new to bitching about something the AFL does that doesn't involve Geelong. But I think he hit the nail on the head with the fact that this opening round only involving 8 clubs and now creating a secondary set of buys through the year is kind of damning in a way, because he spoke about the fact that the AFL and, you know, have been lobbied against for years, from players, from coaches, to have a secondary buy within the year to give players an extra rest, and it has always been knocked back. But now all of a sudden this secondary buy has been brought in, but it benefits some clubs more than others, because his view, and I can see this view quite substantially, is that the buy structure coming in at the start of the year is going to benefit some teams more than others. We look at Carlton, for example, while I stutter over my words. Brisbane hosted Carlton in a blockbuster game. This coming Thursday, Carlton are hosting Richmond in what hopefully will be a blockbuster game. As a Richmond fan, I can only hope we play a different brand to what we did against the Gold Coast last weekend, but it's going to be a huge game. That's going to take a toll on players early, having, you know, such crucial hitouts, and then Carlton walk in to a round 2 bye and get a bit of a break. Not only have they had an extra game to play to get back into their systems, but these teams are sporadically getting breaks in between that are going to have a little bit more benefit to them more than others, and I can see this being a problem. And again, we'll touch on this later in the video because there are a few people that have made some comments to myself on social media that really rein in what opening round or what these experimental rounds should be consisting of. I loved the fact that we just get an extra round of football. My personal belief is that every team should be involved to some capacity. But again, don't want to get ahead of myself. We'll touch on that later. But the 4 games that we were delivered, apart from one, which is a little bit upsetting because that one does involve the team that I love so deeply, were great games of football. The round kicked off on Thursday night with Sydney hosting Melbourne at the SCG in a game that was really the tale of 2 different teams. And while I tipped Sydney to win, I feel it was very one-sided in Sydney's way, in the way that they were able to get their systems in check. They were able to tick a lot of boxes, I think, internally with how they wanted to present their game style and get their own game going. Whereas Melbourne, I feel, fell short of the mark by their own standards, and it's a different Melbourne to what we have seen win that premiership back in, 2022, was it? I want to say 2022. I could be wrong. But, we're only a couple of years out from them winning that grand final over in Perth. And they were so grounded in their systems then. They were one of the best defensive teams in the comp. Moving the ball by foot, they were so precise. But they lacked that severely on Thursday night. Their connection from midfield to forward 50 was some of the worst I've seen them display in a very long time. And while the usual culprits at Melbourne, your Christian Petrarca, your Clayton Oliver, your Jack Viney, Christian Salem really stepped up in this game. They were still all up and about. There was still very limited input from other key players that should have really stood tall. For Melbourne, I really did like Blake Howes on debut. Looked like a very solid defender. I think he's really going to find his own form rather quickly in that defensive structure. And then they had Caleb Windsor running out on the wing, and he looked really composed, really polished. I don't know how long he keeps his spot in that team for when the likes of... His name has eluded me, but it will come back to me because we did have Ed Langdon out there. But we didn't have Lockie Hunter. There we go. Lockie Hunter obviously patrols one wing for Melbourne, while Ed Langdon patrols the other. And having Windsor on that wing, I don't know whether his role changes once we have Hunter come back in and other players come in through circulation. But I really loved his ball use. And that's saying something when you're more reflective on a first game debutant and how he used the ball, compared to how some of the other senior players really should have been using it as well. Max Gawn really struggled to get into this game. And I feel Brodie Grundy had a chip on his shoulder. He obviously wanted to come out swinging, obviously got traded to Melbourne, was very underutilized. He sought a trade to Sydney and had the best possible start possible for his new club. It wasn't just his ability around the ground to be as dominant as he was, but his ability to take Max Gawn out of the game was very crucial. And I think he served up a main course recipe to every other, opponent ruckman and, opposing coach to how you can take Max Gawn out of the game. Getting in and underneath him in contest to block his ability to get the long ball out and to get his tap work going nullified him at centre bounces. He was getting banged up around the ground quite severely. I think at one point it looked like he copped a knee to the lower rib kind of kidney region from Grundy. He copped another hip and shoulder from, I want to say it was McInerney. It could have been another player though. And it took a lot of wind out of him. And I think those knocks are going to compile over the season. And I said in my predictions video, Max Gawn being within Melbourne is probably the most critical player to their season, either staying on track or derailing. And they've just been served up a little taste of what can happen when you take the big man out of the equation. So that very well could be the best way to shut Melbourne down and to stop them from, getting into another consecutive final series. It could also be the difference between making a third final series and being bounced out for that third season consecutively again. On the flip side, Sydney was able to get their game going quite impressively, and it was on the back of not just some youth coming through like Matt Roberts. I felt really found his footing within this team. Again, whether or not opportunity for him comes at the behest of players like Taylor Adams and Callum Mills and Luke Parker coming back into circulation, but I really loved what he threw out there. Isaac Heaney finally getting midfield minutes, and not just Sydney fans, but I think AFL fans, especially those that play your Supercoach and your AFL Fantasy, have really wanted to see Isaac Heaney transition into a proper midfield role. We got a taste of it, and he was sublime. He was one of the best on the night, in my opinion. And just seeing him be able to transition from that forward 50 to becoming that damaging midfielder, but then knowing he has the ability to slot back into that forward 50 if they need that shake-up, really makes him a very strong weapon for Sydney moving forward. Again, though, when those midfield players come back into circulation, do we see him not get those midfield minutes? Does he drop back into the forward 50 and play deep forward? Who knows? Nick Blakey, off of half back, sensational. I rate that player so fucking highly, and his run and carry, his cleanliness with his delivery, his composure, I love everything about him. If I could pinch him from Sydney and lock him up at Richmond, I would lock him up and throw away the key. I absolutely love him. Not just the fact that he can play tall as that key defender, but he has enough speed behind him to be that run and dash, ball carrying half back that a lot of teams like to pride themselves upon and chase. And, just other players started to click. Joel Amartey, he's going to find his feet. It might take a little bit of time, but he'll find his feet gradually as he goes. Logan McDonald now has the opportunity to take the bull by the horns, and that obviously comes with the lack of Lance Franklin in their forward line. His retirement, as sad as it was to see one of the great forwards of all time retire, it now lends not only these players opportunity to get more exposure to the game, but I think it makes Sydney better, because I said it again in my predictions video. I felt the last few years Sydney have always been too Buddy-centric. They always want to get the ball to Buddy. Now they've got so many avenues to pass the ball off to score. You've got your Heenies that can score. You get the ball to Papley, he'll score. You can get your Will Haywards popping up and scoring. You've got your Amarteys, you've got your McDonalds. It's given them a more wider scope of who can deliver within that forward half of the ground. And I think my prediction of Sydney being a potential top 4 side this year really came to light in this game. And I know, round 0, opening round, you can't really hang your hat too much on decisions like that and comments like that. I definitely feel each team kind of gave a little bit of an insight as to how certain operations are going to run, and you can kind of make deductions from that as to whether or not those systems are going to hold true. And I feel Sydney's system that they put on display could be one of the better systems we see play out this year. And on the flip side, with Melbourne, as I said, it seems to be if you can shut down Max Gawn and tie in some inefficiency around the ground, then you're going to be able to get the best of Melbourne at the best of times. And it's sad to see, because Melbourne have been such a proud team that, prides themselves on defensive pressure, defensive structure. And I feel that structure let them down. But Sydney obviously capping off their 2024 season with a win. I was very happy to get that tip correct. Unfortunately, it was the only tip I managed to get correct that week, so we're not going to even get into my fucking tips. But Sydney kicking off the round with a very strong showing against Melbourne. We then shift to Friday, and it was Carlton taking on Brisbane at the Gabba. A game that I honestly thought was done and dusted at halftime. I thought the fact that Brisbane got 40-odd points up, we were looking at a repeat of the demolition that Carlton were handed to them in the preliminary final at the back end of last year. And I thought, here we go, Brisbane are going to once again show that they're a dominating force on the Gabba. They're a force to be reckoned with whenever they get a home game. And then either something switched on at Carlton or something switched off at Brisbane, but the game was a tale of two halves. We had Brisbane in the first half that couldn't do anything wrong, and then in the second half seemingly couldn't do anything right. And Carlton put on one of the best comeback performances that I have seen in recent years, and as a collective unit with the team they've currently got now, probably the best showing I've seen from them collectively since this team has come together. I'm not saying as Carlton as a collective, but this current, Carlton squad. It was very impressive. And as somebody who has reservations about Carlton, sometimes it's a little bit bittersweet to admit, that a team that you might not have a lot of love or appreciation for is doing well. And I know all of us out there have those teams that we kind of sway a little bit more negatively on the fence on to, but compared to others. But Carlton showed that their best is some of the best, and it is very scary. I didn't definitely think there was going to be a 1-point swing in the way of this game at all. I thought, as I said, halftime, seeing that score line, I was confident enough to walk away for a bit and think to myself, yeah, Brisbane's got this in the bag. Third quarter starts and then Carlton start putting the rally on, and Brisbane looked rattled. They just didn't have any answers. And I don't know, as I said, whether it was the fact that Vossi stripped paint off the fucking walls at halftime and got stuck into them, or Brisbane maybe got a little bit more complacent in the way they were playing and just the ball was a lot easier for Carlton to kind of maneuver around the ground. But players that were a little bit quiet in that first half really stood tall. I thought George Hewitt for Carlton really stepped his game up in the absence of players like a Sam Walsh, who I honestly thought was going to leave a gaping hole in Carlton's midfield. I said it when I did the tipping for that game, that I thought Walsh was going to be too hard to replace, but in steps up Hewitt, a player that we know has the ability, but sometimes hasn't had that consistency to fully show that, and he definitely did. I definitely think on the night, he was one of the best, not just for Carlton, but on the field, and really, came into his own. I feel even with Walsh coming back in, this now adds another, string to Carlton's bow. Charlie Curnow got his groove going and did what he usually does. Harry Mackay, who is always in the, the eye of the media in such a negative light for his goal kicking. And I've been one to harshly criticize his ability or lack thereof to kick goals. It was rather poetic for him to be the match winner off his own boot. Probably that kick that he lined up for, you could forgive him for missing because of how much weight that kick had behind it, what was riding on that kick going through. And yet it was one of the most accurate kicks I've seen him drop in a very long time. So seeing the club rally behind him, Nick Newman got behind him in a post-game interview. Charlie Curnow on camera after the game got behind him as well, and both of them turned around and said, would love to see what the media have to say about Harry Mackay this week because he played his heart out. I definitely think he was one of Carlton's best on the night. Patrick Cripps was, able to get into the game. Didn't really light the world on fire, but did what Patrick Cripps does best. I really thought Wiedering and his absence was going to leave too big, again, of a hole to cover. I thought the likes of Danaher, Hipwood, Cameron, McCarthy, they were all going to start getting off the chain, and they just died off real quick. I don't know what happened. There was a couple of quick break moments where Charlie Cameron was able to get out the back from an Adam Sard kind of one-on-one, and he snagged a goal, and it looked like everything was going to go the way of Brisbane. And then obviously we know Harry Mackay straight after that went and kicked the goal that ended up winning them the game. And there was a lot of individual efforts from Brisbane that could have got them over the line, but I don't think they were cohesive enough as a unit, and you can't really depend on a handful of players to get you over that line. Dunkley laid, I think it was 9 tackles. He had a huge game for Brisbane. Lachie Neale, just doing what Lachie Neale does best. Outside of that, Jared Lyons, who is a player that has been on the out for so long, he laid a decent amount of tackles as well. So the midfielders defensively were working their asses off, but I feel the defenders themselves really dropped off and afforded Carlton way too much space around the ground. Especially in the late game, being able to get the space that Harry Mackay, for example, was able to get on Harris Andrews in that one-on-one contest that ended up determining the outcome of the match. That's not something that you usually see Harris Andrews, slacking off and allowing. He's one of those defenders that I've always rated so incredibly highly, and one that I would love personally at my own club, because he's a brilliant reader of the ball in flight. He has great interceptability. He kills almost every ball that comes his way, and he's quick off the mark. He normally doesn't give his opponent that much space because he is so quick with shutting that ball down. I tried to find out, replaying this game, where things broke down. And I don't know whether it's going to be a continuous thing for Brisbane moving forward, but Kitty Coleman going down with that ACL injury, I think it was at the end of the first quarter. I can't remember if it was the end of the first or going into the second, but I think losing him is going to be rather critical to Brisbane's process, because we saw it in the grand final. He's their main distributor out of that halfback line. You get Kitty the ball, and he's going to go do his thing. His release by foot and by hand is absolutely sensational. His pace off the mark is absolutely brilliant. He's, to me, a very individual, unique player that is so niche at Brisbane that I don't think anybody fills that role. Dane Zorko probably now goes back to a halfback flank, or Wilmot shifts from a wing back to halfback flank to kind of fill that void. Zorko obviously doesn't match him in speed, but gives him a little bit more polish with ball use. Wilmot can give that speed, but probably doesn't give that polish with ball use that a Zorko would. So you've got players that can fill the void in one way or another, but not completely. And then Carlton obviously had Sam Doherty go down with an ACL as well, which I think if any player has had the roughest fucking run, it is Sam Doherty. It's his third ACL. He just come back from battling cancer recently as well. It's so terrible to see players go down with injury, especially so early, but to see players continuously get knocked down again and again, it breaks your heart, regardless of whether you support that team or not. So I hope both of them recover well, recover fully. I don't know whether this is going to be too much now for Sam Doherty's body to handle, given now it's his third ACL, even though this is the opposite knee to the two that he has recently done on his opposite side. But it takes its toll. It's going to take a while for them to recover. I think Doherty is more replaceable in the sense that they have, those midfield kind of half-back players at Carlton that can fill that niche. I'm not at all saying this derails Brisbane season losing Kitty Coleman. I just think he's going to be too hard to replace, and that's going to leave a bit of a gap. So they're going to have to restructure their own system a little bit to facilitate that, which could throw things out of whack, because Zorko played a really pivotal game against Carlton, one of Brisbane's best. You take him out of the role he played on the weekend and you throw him into a more defensive role. Do we see him having that kind of impact? It all kind of snowballs on over time again and again. It's going to be very interesting to watch, but Brisbane, I was convinced, was going to win this game by a handful of goals, and I was proven wrong. Carlton starting their season off strong. People already saying baggers are flaggers and all this bullshit. I mean, obviously, opening round, only a handful of teams played. A little bit too hard to gauge where they're at, but if Carlton play the way they did against Brisbane in that second half this week, they could pick up a big win against Richmond, which leads me into that game up at the Gold Coast, with Gold Coast hosting Richmond in one of the worst displays of football I've ever watched as a Richmond supporter, especially in a very recent period of time, given our success that we have had under Damien Hardwick, shifting from a laughingstock to a modern day powerhouse. And people will argue that with me on social media. They'll come at me in the comment section here. I'm not at all saying they're the biggest. I'm not at all trying to compare them to the dynasties that Brisbane or Geelong or Hawthorn set up. But you can't deny that Richmond can be within that conversation. They're not at the same level, but we can still have that discussion. I'm still kind of a little bit lost for words. It still hurts me a little bit to talk about this game, because obviously there was a lot of premeditated heat coming into this game. Hardwick obviously retiring from coaching at Richmond, made it seem like he was retiring at least, saying he wanted to leave the game on a positive note, and we thought we saw the end of him, and then only a few months later, the bastard comes out, he's signed with the Gold Coast, and he's not burnt out anymore, and video footage of him walking up to a boy wearing a Richmond jumper and getting him to take the Richmond jumper off and put a Gold Coast jumper on, and it's, you know, the heat was there. Damien Hardwick coaching his new team against the club that he took to a modern day dynasty, and it couldn't have been scripted any better on paper. And I wish that script was written a lot better for Richmond, because Gold Coast gave us a fucking toweling, and it was embarrassing to watch as a Richmond supporter. I went into that game admittedly saying that I thought Richmond was going to win by, you know, I think it was 9 points I said I thought they were going to win by. I genuinely gave us a chance. Not making excuses, you know, I can say, oh, we didn't have Dusty, we didn't have Nankervis, we didn't have Lynch, but you can only play with the players you have available to you. We still had a very viable team listed, but the fact that half-time was a 10-goal difference and Richmond were only able to score 2 goals in that first half, it was rather damning. It was hard to watch, and I'm not one of those supporters that will leave a game early if their team is getting smacked. I won't turn the TV off if their team is getting smacked. I've sat through some pretty bad smackings before, both live and on television, and I watched the final siren every time. This one was hard to watch, that first half. Just the rally that Gold Coast had going. Ben King was getting it way too easy. Lukosius was popping up left, right, and center. Malcolm Rosas popped off, and that was just their forward 50. I thought maybe taking Noah Bolter out of defense and playing him as a forward out of necessity hurt us defensively. But then Noah Bolter was thrown into the ruck, and I thought he was a big part of our turnaround in that third quarter, because when Richmond brought that deficit back from 60 to about 23, 24 points, I got fucking excited. I'm not going to lie. I thought, here we go. We've got a real game on our hands here. And then Dylan Grimes goes and gives away a stupid 50, and then Nathan Broad concedes a stupid free kick, and it's just little momentum killers like that that really draw excitement. You know, the momentum, it really stings it. It really takes it out, and it's really deflating, especially when your team's on a rally. I think what was more damning for Richmond, though, and don't get me wrong, even in our premiership years, Richmond have historically allowed opposition midfields to run all over the top of them with contested ball, with clearances, but allowing Matt Rowell to have 20 clearances by himself, which is now the second most clearances by any single player in AFL history since documenting stats. I think the record was created in 96 with 22, I believe it was. So he could have very well broken an AFL record in this game. Thankfully, he fucking didn't. But 20 individual clearances on his own, that prick must have been eating super grass before the game, because he was influential. I haven't seen him play that good of a game since his debut game. For those of you who don't remember, when Matt Rowell was on debut, the first 3 games, he polled 3 votes, 3 votes, 3 votes. And that very rarely happens with any player. We thought we were going to see a once-in-a-lifetime generational player. His season then dropped off quite severely. We know he's been hampered with injury in the past as well. I feel this year is going to be a breakout year for a good handful of Gold Coast players. Matt Rowell is one of them. Noah Anderson just did his thing. Will Powell looked absolutely impressive out of that defensive 50. Alex Sexton, moving from forward to defense, an absolutely great move for his career, because I think he was left in limbo a bit as a forward, but as a defender, he really came into his own in that game. You could just list the other Gold Coast players. You know, Took Miller, absolutely superb, just getting back into his systems. You look at Richmond, and there wasn't many players you can really, you know, say they could hold their heads up high. Like, some of them had moments. Daniel Rioli had moments. Morris Rioli Jr. had moments. Noah Bolter had moments. Jaden Short had a couple of moments. Nick Vlosten, probably the only player on the field that I think can hold his head up high. I believe he was named in the AFL Team of the Week, which I still can't wrap my head around that Richmond got a player in that. But it was one of the worst displays from Richmond I've seen in a long time, as I said. And it hurt to see, because I know some players aren't, you know, notoriously known for good clean disposal. We know Tim Taranto got stuck into many times last year for poor turnover. Dion Prestia was poor with the ball. Jaden Short even had poor moments. If Uze is wanting to implement a style of gameplay with Richmond that seemed to be wanting to get the ball moving quick but by foot, as opposed to Hardwick's game style of linking up with that handball and getting a more manic Richmond game going, then Richmond's makeup is going the wrong way about it. We don't have the right core. Prestia, Taranto, and Hopper, I think, can't coexist together in that midfield as a core three. I think individually, paired with other players, they can exist well. But, you know, Shea Bolton might have kicked 3 goals, but outside of kicking those 3, he didn't really do much at all. And I feel injecting him into the midfield would have given us a little bit more cleaner disposal, would have given us a change of pace, another avenue to, you know, just run the ball out of the middle, get a little bit of space between. Daniel Rioli, coming off of half-back, there was rumour that he could potentially go into a midfield role this year. I would love to see him rotate off of the half-back flank into the midfield and be able to have those midfield minutes where we can see his clean disposal. His breakaway speed is one of the best, I think, in the game when he's got his game going. His delivery by foot is absolutely sublime. Having a Liam Baker go through the midfield more gives us a little bit of tenacity. Jaden Short, we've seen in the past, he gets some midfield minutes, he can impact because he's got a long driving ball. Even if it just clears the ball out of the middle, if it gets turned over deep, so be it. We get that clearance on the board. We're winning the ball. We can't rely on a slower midfield to be able to get these clearances. We can't rely on a player like a Thompson Dow changing our fortunes, even though he shows a lot of promise as a young kid. We can't hang our hat on a young kid changing our fortune for us. The one thing I am happy about with Richmond is when they did have that turnaround, the system looked good. The ball movement was great. The pressure that we were applying was fantastic. It was the same way they started that practice match against Collingwood. And I really loved the game of debutant Seth Campbell. He kicked a couple of goals, hit up some players, got them involved in the game, laid some crucial tackles. I think he keeps his spot this week. I'm very hopeful he gets another chance because I love when kids get opportunity and they take that opportunity by the horns. It's easy to kind of drop off into obscurity a little bit when your team is getting demoralized, but he was one of those players that didn't seemingly drop his head all game. So at least we can hang our hats on that. Gold Coast, however, walk away with a huge win and are sitting on top of the ladder for the first time in their club's history, which some people have been making memes about. You know, it only took half the competition to not play for them to finish on top of the ladder and all this jazz, but got to give credit where it's due. You know, they're not going to, by all means, finish on top of the ladder. I don't think they're a top 4 team, but they've really changed my perspective of missing out on finals this year to playing finals, because their system that they've got in place, especially under Damien Hardwick, he's got one hell of a team under his belt. And this could be finally the time where it just clicks for Gold Coast. It really could be. The final game of the round, GWS Collingwood, a rematch of the other preliminary final we saw last year. I thought Collingwood were going to win this one in a close contest, but GWS never looked like they were ever going to drop this game. They were in control from the beginning, and I said it again, referring back to my predictions video, that I feel GWS the past few years have always been there and about due to the fact that they have never had all the right personnel on the field at the same time. And they still are missing some, I wouldn't say key components, but some young talent that they've had the last couple of years that have really stood tall. Those players like Cumming, I believe, is out at the moment, and I rate him as a defender for GWS. They've got some other players that could come potentially back into that mix and have some say in how the structure goes about. But they looked good. They looked clean. Kieran Briggs is a hell of a ruckman. I think he's got the ability this year again to establish himself as one of the elite of the competition. I think in my mind right now, probably a bold statement, but I think he's a top 5 ruckman in the comp. I think he could push top 3 this year. He looks really good. He's got great ball use around the ground. He gets first access to the ball. He's got a great midfield core to get the ball to. Tom Green, fit and firing, looks so fucking good. He's going to have an All-Australian year this year. I can feel it. And I feel if GWS have a good year, he could really give the Brownlow a good shake. I definitely think he walked away with 3 votes from this game, personally, from what I saw. Again, that's objective when it comes to those types of comments, so don't fucking come at me for them, but he was great. Josh Kelly, I think, had 10 score involvements off his own boot. Lockie Whitfield locking down defensive back 50 with 14 marks for the game. Young Cadman kicked a couple of goals. Toby Green, when he was able to get involved, still looks damaging. He kicked one of the better goals of the weekend. Getting chased on the boundary and being able to just kick that, outside of the boot snag was really great to watch. Jesse Hogan, a lot of people have been saying he's in career best form. He's a chance for the Coleman, and I laughed that off. But he looked so clean, and it's not just his ability to pluck marks inside 50 and convert, but his ability to push up the ground and be one of those forwards that play as a linking player. I think that's going to be very damaging against opposition teams, given his ability to pluck a decent ball out of the air. But the big surprise packet for GWS was Callum Brown, and he stood up last year as a goal-scoring avenue, but I never thought he'd be a 5-goal-a-game player, and he comes out and kicks 5. I think it was the most any player kicked this weekend, and he looked great. He's not a small forward, he's not a tall forward, he's kind of that in-between that can play tall, and his overhead marking ability is so fucking sensational. They've really found a player in this kid. GWS, again, top 4 threat. Again, a little bit maybe too premature basing off of one game, but if this is the system that they're going to carry through, and I'm basing my comment again on the systems that we have seen played out this particular round, Sydney and GWS, to me, look to be the most likely so far to finish top 4. I think Collingwood, obviously, they're going to get their shit together. They'll finish top 4 as well. But GWS and Sydney's processes looked the best to myself, objectively as a neutral supporter watching, as the best over the weekend. Collingwood were able to stay in the fight for as long as they could, but in the end, GWS were just too strong. They just kept pulling away, and every time Collingwood would kick 1 or 2, GWS would kick 1 or 2 and just get that break again. Wasn't without, a few players from Collingwood standing tall, and it's the usual suspects. Nick Dacos had a huge game for Collingwood. He'd definitely be within the votes as well. Brother Josh played another good game. I definitely feel that Collingwood's main struggle is their lack of key position forwards. While they've brought in Lachie Schultz, who I think is going to really complement Collingwood's forward structure well, don't get me wrong, Dan McStay missing a whole year with his knee is going to hurt them. And Mason Cox can't be relied upon as a key position forward because he doesn't play consistently well enough to do so. Ash Johnson can play tall, but I don't think he has that level of consistency yet in his game. And Brody Myercheck can't be expected to carry the forward line off his own boot. You can't expect Jamie Elliott to pluck screamers every fucking week and, convert to goals. We can't expect Bobby Hill to light the world on fire like he did in the grand final and, boot a few goals off his own boot. It was a thereabouts game for a lot of players. I felt Scott Pendlebury looked a little bit off the pace compared to what we've seen, and that just could be age catching up to him. Similar to some other players as well. I think what damned Collingwood the most, and something that I felt we wouldn't see from Collingwood because last year they were easily the best defensive team in the competition, just the level of space they afforded GWS players was way too much. And I'm not talking space like space, I'm talking space. Like, they were unmanned. They would go pick up one player and another player would be loose. They would always have have an extra player continuously moving on so they could get their chain work moving. Collingwood almost looked like they were bamboozled, like they weren't prepared for this kind of style of GWS play. And it's not concerning, again, by any means. It's only round 0. Teams are going to underperform earlier in the year. They're going to find their form as the season goes on. But what GWS delivered against Collingwood, I don't think a lot of people would have expected. I think everyone expected, they're hosting the game, but Collingwood's going to continue their reign of strong. They're going to continue being the best team in the comp, the standard bearer. And I feel they fell marginally short, and rather marginally, by the standards that they set last year, which could be a little bit harsh, but I think given the standards they did set, I think they're going to have a lot of harsh interpretations of where they should be as a club. I said in my predictions video again, I feel they're one of the most cohesive premiership teams that we have seen in a very long time. I even went on a limb and said that I think they're going to be the next three-peat team that we see get that three-peat going. They definitely didn't play three-peat football. They didn't even play premiership football against GWS. Again, you can't rely on a couple of individual efforts to carry you over the line. Nick Dacos is only in his third year. We can't be expecting a third-year player to carry solely that entire team. But GWS too good in the end, capping off a very solid opening round. As I said, all games of football in some retrospect were great games of football to watch. Sellout games, great crowd and atmosphere for each of them. And there wasn't really much negatively to take away from each individual game themselves. I think there was 3 talking points total over that weekend that I want to discuss. The first being, and I think the most talked about in the media, was there was an instance with Mason Cox pre-game, which I had some reservations about and opinions on before we saw the full kind of scope of what truly happened. But we saw footage of GWS's midfield group with Shane Mumford, their ruck coach, kind of getting into their process of warming up before the game. Mason Cox comes through, pushes past a GWS player, I think it was Josh Kelly, pushes Mumford out of the way, grabs a ruck contest ball and takes off. And it looked like from that angle that it was a GWS kind of group going on. He's plucked a GWS ball out of the air and he's fucked off with it. And I had some reservations because I've got some opinions about Mason Cox as a player. I won't divulge and share those because I'll probably trigger some Collingwood supporters and get dragged. So I'm not here for that. But further footage on AFL 360 showed that Collingwood had their processes set up. They were doing their own ruck work, and the umpires at the beginning, while they're warming up, can do a couple of ball ups with opposite, different players from opposing teams to practice their own bouncing and throwing of the ball, and then the ruckman can come through and practice their tap work and all that kind of stuff. And essentially, Mason Cox had one more hit to do with this particular ruck coach and with the umpire, and the GWS pack moved in between that, so Mason was trying to divert through that to get the ball. It was the way the media presented it, hung him out to dry, electively only showed certain angles of that footage. That really, again, just comes back to questioning the media's intent on how things are portrayed. I've got a video that I'm planning on doing soon where I know it's going to trigger some people, but I think it's a great discussion point. So keep your eyes peeled for that, because I've been getting dragged on Twitter all fucking night about some comments I've made about it. But that really, again, stems back not only to just that moment in isolation, but other comments about, this round and, how the media kind of go about electively talking about things. Kane Corns, at the end of the GWS Collingwood game, turned around and said, "It's only round 1, it's not panic stations, we're just getting a feel for the game." Within 24 hours of making that comment, he's making comments about Richmond players not deserving of being able to get game time and dragging Richmond like he always does, because we know he's got a fucking fascination with St Kilda and with fucking Richmond and just dragging them whenever he can. I think the media needs to be more, hard-nosed and straight with how they present themselves. I think bias needs to be checked at the door. I think if something's going to be reported upon, it needs to be reported on fully before, not before we have all the facts. We need to have everything at our disposal before comments are made, because there is so much egg on people's faces with this Mason Cox incident that, Mark Robinson, we all know Mark Robinson. He had his reservations about it all, but then they saw the footage and he even said, I was one of those people that had a negative thing, but now seeing it, this is why we need to have access to this type of footage before things are, things are said. And I agree with that. Moving forward from that, though, the other 2 talking points I want to bring up is from the Gold Coast Richmond game. And there were 2 particular moments that I want to draw attention to, because we know the AFL has already set precedent on the head-high hitting this year. We've already seen Sam Pepper hit for 3 weeks. I think Jimmy Webster got 6 weeks for his hit on Jai Simpkin. So we now know this year, if there's going to be a head-high hit, it's going to be taken very seriously because that precedence has been set. I'm hoping precedence has been set in one instance on the weekend, but not in the other. The first I want to talk about is an instance with Dylan Grimes and I think it was Thomas Berry from the Gold Coast. Dylan Grimes takes a mark, deep defensive 50, gets a little bit of a push, flops to try and draw a 50. Umpire tells him to get back up, stop acting, move the ball on. He gets up, proceeds to kick the ball out of bounds, so he turns the ball over. Thomas Berry instigates front-on contact and gets in his face. Dylan Grimes essentially grabs him by the scruff of the jumper, throws him down. 50 metres paid, puts him in front of goal. They convert. There was definitely no need for Dylan Grimes to do that, but there was 100% a flop from Berry in that moment, and I feel if the umpire is going to disregard one flop, but then only seconds later allow another flop to go without reprimand or whatever, I think we need to not set precedents in that fact. We need to have more clarity on consistency in that matter, and umpire consistency is something I think we're going to continuously talk about for years because it's something they've never fucking had. The one thing I hope they have set precedents with, however, is a free kick that was paid against Nathan Broad, and this has got the AFL world talking as well. We know about deliberate rush behinds and how if you take the ball over the line with no pressure, you're going to concede a free kick to the opposition. Camden McIntosh gets the handball to Nathan Broad. He's probably at that point 15, 20 metres out from goal. He's got the ball. He's looking around. He's getting pursued by, I think it was Malcolm Rosas. He's stepping backwards. He steps over the the point line, thinking it's okay. He's going to move the ball on. Umpire pays deliberate rush behind, free kick to Malcolm Rosas. Malcolm Rosas, I believe, converted the goal from that point. And a lot of people are wondering whether or not there was enough time to get rid of the ball, whether it was the right call. I've seen people on Twitter who are active umpires say that they believe it was the wrong call. I believe it was the right call because I personally think he could have gotten the handball back to McIntosh. He could have kicked the ball 50 metres and turned it over 50 metres down the line. But if that is going to be paid a free kick, they need to be consistent in setting that as precedence and making sure they pay them all, because we have seen that happen a few times, maybe more over the past couple of years, and it's been allowed to go, without that consequence. As I said on social media, maybe he should have dropped the ball and accidentally fumbled it, because then the umpire would have said, yeah, whatever. There was a couple of times where Gold Coast players were fumbling the ball and paddling it towards the boundary line, which to me is deliberate out of bounds, but not paid because they're under pressure. So I think that rule needs to be looked at in the way that players are taking advantage of it, in ways where if they fumble a clean ball and they're not really that much under pressure, but they accidentally drop it 5 metres out and it rolls over, I think there's a grey area there. But again, it just comes back to precedence, and that's what I want to talk about. We just need to make sure the umpires are finding consistency. To me, both free kicks, but we just need to find a balance. We need to make sure it's consistent through the year now that precedence has been set. Now that I've got my baby Wah-Wahs out of the way, I think it's time to turn to the Hip and Shoulder 2024 MVP award. Again, an invisible award that they're never going to know they ever won. They're never going to give a fuck about winning. But I'm going to go through each game and give my 3-2-1 votes. And at the end of the year, whoever finishes on top of that board will be named the person that I think is the MVP for the year. Now, this is going to be completely objective. I'm going to be picking 3 players that you might not agree with at home. So always feel free to reach out on social media in the comments down below. Tell me if I've done something wrong. Tell me if I should be looking at other players. It's always a great discussion point when things like this come to play. Before naming my 3-2-1, however, I am going to list the players for each game that I feel are honourable mentions, or players that I would have loved to have given a vote to, but I think other players might have been a little bit more influential. For Sydney, Nick Blakey is the one that misses out. I think his ball use was sublime, but I think the players I've chosen for Sydney in this respective voting were more influential than he was on the night. And Christian Petrarca for Melbourne, I thought, had a huge game. There was one moment of play that was so Petrarca-like and so awe-inspiring to watch. I think within a 10-second patch, they had a goal kicked against them. He had the ball tapped down his throat, and he goes and slams home a goal for himself. And I thought, fuck, if any player can do that with that much momentum in that short of a period of time, it's Christian Petrarca. And in those kind of instances, I see Gary Ablett, Dustin Martin, those type of players that are notorious for doing that. Christian Petrarca shows glimpses of that sometimes, and it's very good to watch. His best is some of the best. I love Christian Petrarca as a player. But when it comes to the votes for the Sydney-Melbourne game, I've given 3 votes to a player who I feel wasn't just best on ground for his own individual effort, but being able to nullify his opponent, who notoriously I think is known as probably the best in his particular role on the field, is Brodie Grundy. I think Grundy needs to be credited here for 3 votes. His game was huge. He was monumental. And again, not just for what he did, but what he was able to stop Max Gawn from doing. And we have known Max Gawn to be the premier ruckman of the competition for many years. And for him to have little to no influence because Brodie Grundy was able to nullify him, that's huge. That sets the tone for Brodie Grundy as a player this year. We now know he's just not got the ability to stand out on his own, but he can now be a player who gets in and under and punishes his direct opponent around the ground enough to draw some air out of him, to knock him down, to, bring him back a peg. And I really love what he did. So he's getting my 3 votes. My 2 votes goes to Jack Viney from Melbourne. And I think as far as individual efforts go, he could have very well pushed for best on ground in this game. Laid a ridiculous number of tackles, had a solid number of contested clearances. His ball use was great. As far as fantasy football goes, I've always loved him as a prospect for this year. Again, though, one of those players that might have a purple patch for a few weeks and then, he just drops off the face of the earth and he doesn't play up to those standards. But if he's setting the tone early, he's in for a big year. And I loved that when some Melbourne players, the usual suspects that we're used to seeing standing tall, failed to deliver, Viney was able to be one of those constant sources from them all night that just kept going and going and going. And it's not often you see Jack Viney kick 2 goals. I mean, he laid that monster number of tackles. He has 30-odd possessions. He kicks 2 goals. It probably was deserving of a best-on-ground performance, but I think what Grundy did edges him out just a little bit. And the 1 vote that I'm handing out for this game goes to Isaac Heaney. I think his transition from forward to midfield really reaped reward, not just for himself individually, but for Sydney as a whole. I want to see him stay in that midfield rotation for as long as they can run him in there, because I feel it's about time he's starting to get those minutes. But we know Horse as a coach is going to mix things up and be a little bit more erratic, and I really hope that when Taylor Adams, Luke Parker, Callum Mills, those type of players come back into circulation, that it's not going to be at the detriment of Heaney being forced to be just an inside 50 forward. He's shown that he has the capability and the engine to be a midfielder. It's about time they start fucking using him there. Moving on to the second game of the round, Brisbane hosting Carlton. Honourable mentions here, Lachie Neale for Brisbane. Went about his game as you would expect Lachie Neale to go about his game. I just feel there were many players ahead of him on the night, especially those from the opposition that he was taking on, which leads me to the honourable mention of Charlie Curnow. I feel he could have been a lot more damaging on the night. He wasn't, but his efforts were still something that need to be mentioned because he still went about his game as well as you'd expect him to do. My 3 votes for this one and best on ground, I'm giving to George Hewitt from Carlton. And as I said before when covering that game, I feel he really stepped up into the hole that Sam Walsh left incredibly well. He laid a ridiculous amount of tackles again. He had some great centre clearances. He got his hands on the ball plenty of times. With an open hole, when a door opens, you've got the chance to grab opportunity. And he ran with it. And to me, he was best on for Carlton on the night. And I know that might come weirdly to some, and some are probably going to question that, but I loved how he went about his game, and every time he was near the ball, he made something happen. And I think he was integral to helping Carlton bring that margin back and get that lead when it truly mattered. The 2 votes for this game, I'm giving to Josh Dunkley from Brisbane. He was just one of those players that continuously kept going and going and going, and we know he's someone that can deliver. But his tackle numbers again, and I just love tackle numbers. I love midfielders that have a high defensive pressure count, just the 1%ers laying tackles, getting in and under. It's what I love about players like Josh Dunkley, and he just led from the pack from the word go, and he just didn't stop. He was one of very few that when that onslaught from Carlton was coming on, that just kept about his way, didn't seem rattled, just kept going at it. I was very impressed. I'm lost for words. There wasn't many players in that second half for Brisbane that I can really say stood tall, apart from Lachie Neale, maybe a Dane Zorko. But Josh Dunkley's game I thought was huge for Brisbane. And the 1 vote, I'm giving it to Harry Mackay. And I think it's because I think he's deserving of his just rewards this round. He gets rubbished every week. As I said earlier, I'm one of those, neutral supporters that rubbish him for his goal kicking. But it wasn't just his composure in front of goal, especially when they needed it with that last kick, but his ability to rotate into the ruck and be influential around the ground in the ruck contest. I feel they've found within him a string they can add to their bow. And him being a centre half forward that can transition into the ruck and be a little bit more mobile around the ground and have input further up the ground while letting Charlie Curnow be that deep forward 50 player is the perfect mix for Carlton. Because I've said it many times in the past, whether it be on video, whether it be just comments that I make watching games, Curnow and Mackay have a habit of clashing with each other too many times in that forward 50 because they lead for the same ball, they go for the same contest, they don't break apart, they don't allow each other too much space. Too many roosters in the hen house is how I like to say it. They both want to rule the roost when I feel there needs to be a compromise. And I think Harry Mackay being that player who can now transition up the ground more and, use the ball a little bit more better around that upper part of the ground and letting Curnow be that one-on-one offensive threat. Great makeup for Carlton. So that's my top 3 for them. Gold Coast Richmond. I would love to say that I had some positives to talk about Richmond here with the vote count, but unfortunately there's only one, and my honourable mention is going to go to Nick Vlosten, because I feel he was the only Richmond player on the day that for 4 quarters showed any consistency. I feel we would have had a lot more goals scored against us if it wasn't for his defensive pressure. His interceptability is one of the best in the competition, and I don't care if you think that's Richmond bias. I love him. I'm surprised this guy hasn't gotten an All-Australian jacket yet, to be quite honest with you. I think there's been many times where he could have been in contention. Honourable mentions for the Gold Coast. I'm giving it to Touk Miller. Again, great defensive pressure in that middle of the ground, but was still able to get plenty of centre bounce attendances, was able to get plenty of clearances, found plenty of the ball. His use was great. Ben King finishing on 4 goals or 5 goals. I can't remember how much he ended up kicking. He kicked a bag though. I think what kept him out of the votes was the fact that it was a patch where he went quiet. He did most of his damage in the first half when they put that pile on. He probably would have pushed into the votes if he had been a little bit more accountable for the full game, but we saw enough from him to know that he can be a threat if used well, and he could be a cheeky chance for Coleman contention this year. My 3 votes though, and we talked him up in the discussion of the game, it's hard to look past Matt Rowell. You have a bloke who almost breaks a clearance record, had the ball on a string, was defensively laying tackles as well in the middle. He had one of the most complete games I've seen for a player in years, and he gets 3 votes hands down. And there is talk that TAB and Sportsbet and everything else, he has been the most bet on player in a very long time after one game of football for Brownlow fancies. Everybody started putting money on him for the Brownlow this year off of this game. I'm still a little bit contentious on the fact that Richmond historically let opposition midfielders get plenty more of the ball than they should, but there's no discrediting this guy's game. He was a fucking machine. 2 votes for this game I'm giving to Will Powell in defence. He was incredibly clean with the ball. His interceptability was absolutely great. There was one point where Richmond looked like they were going to get a fast break from defence into the forward half. Will Powell had fallen over. He had slipped. He let his opposition player get off him. While he was on the ground, he was still able to do a slips catch and mark the ball. There was nothing stopping this bloke. If there was a ball to be won, he was there to win it. He looked incredibly impressive, and I think he's going to be an absolute weapon out of that defensive 50 for Gold Coast this year. And my 1 vote goes to Noah Anderson. We'll come to see what he can deliver, and I think this year is the year again where Gold Coast are going to have a handful of players that have breakout years, and I think collectively, Noah Anderson and Matt Rowell are going to be 2 players that break out in a big way. In my predictions video, I said I thought Noah Anderson was going to get his first All-Australian jacket. He's done himself every favour possible by starting the year off how he did. Final game of the round, GWS Collingwood. This is one that's probably going to upset some, but I'll start with the honourable mentions. Callum Brown's 5 goals was not enough to get him into the votes, and people are going to think I'm fucking crazy for letting all of these high goal kickers off. But I think once I explain how I've gone about the votes that I have given, it might make a little bit more sense. And Lachie Whitfield as well for GWS. There's no honourable mentions to Collingwood here, unfortunately. But Lachie Whitfield, again, defensive 50, 14 marks, very clean with use of the ball, getting back to his best. And Lachie Whitfield at his best, especially back in 2019 when they made that grand final. 2018, 2019, Lachie Whitfield's probably the best we've seen him. I think he's on track to getting back to that peak performance, and that's exciting for GWS fans. My 3 vote goes to Tom Green. He was in everything. He was under everything. He is going to give the Brownlow a shake this year. He is fighting fit. He is ready to go. Breakout season ahead. I know he's already broken out in bits and pieces, but this could be where he stamps his name amongst the elite of the competition. I'm so excited about this kid, and I was hoping his ties to Richmond would bring him to Richmond, but he's stayed true to GWS, and I think they're going to reap big rewards. I fucking rate this kid so highly. 2 votes goes to Nick Dacos. Just missing out on the 3 votes. And I think Tom Green's influence for GWS was more influential in my eyes to Nick Dacos and Collingwood, because I think while Tom Green was effective as an individual, he was able to also cohesively bring his teammates into the game, whereas Nick Dacos really stood out individually but didn't really stand out as one of those bringing people into the game type of players. He didn't really have much help around him, which is unfortunate to say, because as I said, we're used to seeing more out of Collingwood, but it was hard to discredit Nick Dacos's input individually, and he needs to be obviously named accordingly. And the 1 vote I'm giving to Josh Kelly from GWS. Had a stack of the ball on his own and had 10 direct score involvements off his own boot. And when you look at the gap between GWS and Collingwood at the end of the game on the scoreboard, you could say that Josh Kelly himself in those direct involvements was critical to getting GWS over the line how they did. And that's why I was able to justify giving him the 1 vote, even though you could justify that Callum Brown kicking fucking 5 goals was that difference maker. You know, I could have really flipped it. I could have given a 1 vote to each, and I'm not going to break my systems by doing that, but that's how I've gone about it. So leading currently the Hip and Shoulder MVP award for the 2024 season, we obviously have a 4-way tie. We have Brodie Grundy from Sydney, we have George Hewitt from Carlton, we have Matt Rowell from Gold Coast, and we have Tom Green from GWS. To end off the video, I am going to turn to some comments that have been made to myself on social media, and it is something that I'm actively going to do every week. I'm going to turn to Facebook, I'm going to turn to Twitter, and I'm even going to turn to the comment sections of these videos. So do reach out to me on socials. You can find those linked down below, and also reach out in the comment section as well to have the chance of your comments popping up and give me some discussion points, because that's what this is all about. This is about building a community that shares a passion for this game, that can come together and have creative discussions and a little bit of banter and everything in between. The first comment I got was on Facebook from Roscoe, who said, seeing as they were 4 cracking games to set expectations sky high, would the AFL consider a 5-year trial of the same format? I feel they need to ramp up the promotion of it and rebrand it. Round 0 just does not have enough sparkle to it. And I completely agree. I think that this is something that needs to be further looked at, just like Gather Round is now a permanent fixture. I've got my personal ideas on how opening round should be branded. Round 0 doesn't make sense. It should just be round 1. If it's kicking the year off, it's round 1, right? That's how I feel about it. Following up on that comment, I received another on Facebook from a friend of mine named Dom, who said, could the AFL have utilised this long weekend in Victoria and South Australia to schedule a few games in Melbourne and Geelong, nighttime, not in heat because it was fucking hot down here, plus 1 game in South Australia, the Showdown, and 1 game in Western Australia, the Derby? Why not a full opening round to start the season? To me, it felt like a selection of privileged kids got their Christmas presents on Christmas morning, while the other less special kids were made to wait until Boxing Day. I completely agree. I think if they're going to do an opening round, all teams should be involved. It then takes away what Chris Scott was talking about on AFL 360 that I started this video off with, talking about the fact that this new secondary buy that's been added now affords teams beneficial of buys before other teams, after other teams. Teams have had exposure to a game of football prior to others. There was no need for it to only be 8 teams. They could have facilitated having those extra teams play. And my thought process of opening round should be how they've done Gather Round. And my personal opinion about Gather Round, which last year was the first, running of that example, when all teams went to Adelaide and played in Adelaide to get exposure there. Why can't opening round act like Gather Round and have every team go to the Gold Coast, or every team go to Western Australia, or every team go to New South Wales, and have them collectively be exposed in those states? Especially, as Dom pointed out in this comment, we've just had a long weekend. They could have had football Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, even Monday on the public holiday if they wanted to do it that way. I think the more football, the better. I'm open to having fixtures where we see Thursday through Monday. We've got football on those days. Tuesday, Wednesday, we get the breaks. Again, though, it could be short turnover for a team that has maybe a game on a Sunday and then they're expected to play on a Thursday, and it's going to cause uproar. So logistically, maybe it doesn't make sense. But I do agree, moving forward, if opening round is going to be a thing, every single team needs to be involved. Perfect way to draw big crowds, as explained here in this comment, would to see over in Western Australia, Fremantle versus West Coast for the Western Derby. We can see the Showdown in Adelaide with Port Adelaide and Adelaide kicking off their seasons. There was a floated idea that teams that played in opening round should be playing against each other in round 1 to make it completely fair, so they don't have an advantage over other teams because they've had exposure already. So Carlton and Richmond, I think, the only team coming out of opening round that played a game then and are now playing a game again. They could have done Gold Coast GWS this round. They could have done Melbourne versus Brisbane. They could have done Sydney. You know what I'm saying? You know what I'm saying here? Like, just have those teams play against each other was an idea floated, and I think that could be a viable way to handle it as well if they're going down a specific route where only a couple of teams are going to play. But I don't think they should limit it to a couple of teams. It's definitely something that I think moving forward, if they're going to lock it in, all 18 teams need to be involved. Well, obviously 19 once Tasmania comes in, but good luck trying to sort that out, because then we've got an odd number of teams and we don't have enough. Someone's going to have to miss out. So I don't even fucking know. Again, on Facebook, Blake reaches out to me and turns around and says, is it time to jump on the Flag Suns bandwagon? A little bit too early to say, given it was opening round, but as I said before, with how Gold Coast played and the structures that Hardwick can have them running, I don't think they're a premiership threat yet, but give them a couple of years and I think they'll be well in contention because they've got the pieces they need. Hardwick's already said that they're probably they've got 90% of the premiership team they need. They only need a couple of players, and I think now that Hardwick's up there, could they lure a Dustin Martin at the end of this year? Could they find other players wanting to come back or get on board the bandwagon per se? So I don't think personally I'm getting on the bandwagon, but it's exciting to see that Gold Coast finally have a makeup that could see them become successful. And the final comment comes from my brother Corey, who says, thoughts on Richmond's performance?
Hello, darkness, my old friend.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think that's the perfect time to end the video. I want to thank you all for joining me. Obviously, these videos are going to be a longer format because when it comes to discussing them, each game and breaking it down and then turning to comments from social media and doing voting and everything else, it's going to compile. And I mean, this was only for 4 games, and I think we're going to run for about an hour or so. So moving forward, it could be a much fucking longer thing. Maybe I need to cut down as much as I talk, but it's still a learning process for me. And as I said in the beginning when I made this channel, I'm very passionate about AFL football. I love talking about it, and I think that's going to start translating with the content that I do. So I do hope people appreciate the fact that while these videos might be longer format videos that you're used to watching or listening to, that they're informative, that they're in-depth enough to take on board, that you appreciate them as much as I appreciate making them. So if you could hit that like button down below, if you do enjoy what I do, feel free to do so. As I said in the comment section down below, if you've got any more creative names than the round recap that you want to drop down, or you've got any comments about opening round, or you want to talk about anything else AFL related moving into the next round, knowing that I'm going to highlight comments that you'd like to talk about or ask myself, feel free to leave them down below. If you're into Supercoach, there is a Supercoach video up on my channel already where you can get the Supercoach League code to join. If you do footy tipping, you can join my footy tipping competition. I'll link all that down below as well. Get on board. As I said, we're building a big community hopefully here. Slowly but surely we're going to get there. It's going to take a bit of a grind, just like new channels always do, but really looking forward to what the future has to hold for us here on the Hip and Shoulder. But that's it from me, guys. I'm out of here, and as always, I will catch you guys next time.